Hello, folks. Welcome to Update Brazil. I'm Alan dos Santos, and I am with Jeffrey Nyquist from the United States. How's it going, Jeff?
Hey, Alan, how's it going with you out there in Brazil? We're even hearing about the violence in Rio over here.
Yes, Brazil. It's getting worse every day. I mean, the whole world is going down so fast. But the problem is we have bigger problems that people are not paying attention, and that's why I would like to discuss that with you, Jeff. Today we are going to talk about this weapon of mass destruction. We are not, how can I say, we are not aware of this real danger. Look at this. Look at this. This news that came out during this week, Jeff. Russia reports destruction of all remaining chemical weapons. Before we start talking about chemical weapons, I would like to quote your book here. You put a quotation here from the Soviet military text. Well, it says, "The appearance of a nuclear rocket weapon radically changed previous concepts of the nature of war. Modern nuclear rocket war, in its destructive and death-dealing potential, cannot be compared with previous war. Mass application of nuclear rocket weapons makes it possible within a very short time to force a country from the war, or a number of countries, even those with relatively large territories." We're talking about the United States here, right? "Well-developed economies and populations of on the order of tens of millions." So, Jeff, between biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons, what is the worst one?
Well, potentially, biological weapons are the most dangerous. And this book came out in 1964 by Brigadier General Rothschild, was Tomorrow's Weapons, Tomorrow's Wars. And he was the head of research for America's biological weapons program back in the 60s. And he talks about a type of attack he describes in his book called polar outbreak attack, which is an attack by anthrax. You seed a cold air mass in the Arctic with anthrax, and it comes down over North America, and it can infect a third of the people in the United States east of the Rocky Mountains. I mean, just think about that. That is its potential. And anthrax is 90-something% fatal, pulmonary anthrax. If you breathe, you see, when you seed a cloud with a biological weapon, people breathe, I think it's about 8 gallons of air a minute. And when you seed a cloud, and that cloud is a cold air mass, and cold air, falls. And so as that cold air mass passes over the continent, it descends and it drops the anthrax as it goes, and it's mixed in with the air, and then people breathe it. And if they make the particles like 5 microns, if they're smaller, you'll breathe them out again. If they're too big, they'll get stuck going down towards the lung. So they have to make the particles of the anthrax the right size to breathe them in and for it to stay in the lung. And then you develop pulmonary anthrax, which is like 98% fatal. It's an extremely dangerous, so these particles are milled. And of course, if you were able to infect a third of the people east of the Rocky Mountains, you're talking about 60 million people dying, right, in one biological attack. And what Rothschild points out, it's 600 times cheaper to kill someone with a biological weapon than with a nuclear weapon. They're very inexpensive, yeah. So that's an example from the book. Chemical weapons, of course, are battlefield weapons. They generally don't use those weapons on civilian areas, though they can. They've got chemical attacks on water supplies with toxin weapons are probably the most lethal kind of attack, where they, that in Cuba, the Russians instructed the Cubans on how to poison the headwaters of the Mississippi River in the United States. which fed many of the aquifers, feed many of the fresh water sources for drinking water in the US. So that would be something the Cubans would do at the outbreak of World War III. That was their assignment, to poison the fresh water in the United States with a chemical weapon. So this is an examples of chemical weapons used strategically. Most chemical weapons are battlefield weapons used to make your troop attacks more powerful. So let's say you're attacking in a 25-mile wide section of battlefield front line. You saturate that area with artillery shells laden with, nerve gas, let's say. And the enemy troops, they'd have to be wearing suits, because nerve agent, you don't have to breathe it, it just has to touch your skin. And if your skin absorbs even a small amount of nerve agent, you can go into convulsions and you can die or just be disabled. And then the troops of the side that uses the nerve agent can come in wearing suits, wearing protective chemical gear. And they can come in and just wipe out the paralyzed defending troops, because the defending troops have been hit by a chemical agent. So it's a way for an army to destroy a section of the enemy's front and break through and win a war. So that's the importance of chemical weapons. And of course, the United States and Russia have chemical weapons. And of course, as this news story that came out yesterday pointed out, that Russia is claiming that they have destroyed their chemical stockpiles according to treaty. The US stockpiles, which are very, I don't even know if they're effective anymore, they're very overaged. We have budget problems in trying to safely get rid of them. Of course, safely getting rid of chemical weapons is very expensive. And I must say, it's doubtful the Russians are getting rid of theirs, because in the 90s, the Russians were supposed to have gotten rid of their binary chemical weapons. And I think it was in the year 2001 or 2, Western weapons inspectors found, disguised as fertilizer, both of the components separately located of the Russian binary chemical weapons. So the Russians, they cheat. There's a book that my friend, the late Joseph Douglas, put together called "Why the Soviets Violate Arms Control Treaties." That's the title of the book. And in it, he has a number of defectors and experts writing about the massive violations of just about every treaty that the Russians have ever signed, going back more than half a century. The founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, had a saying. He said, "Treaties are like pie crusts. They are meant to be broken." Okay. And of course, the idea that Putin is telling us the truth, I mean, he might be, but how do you tell if they're lying? Well, their lips are moving. That's how the Russians do. The Russians even lie when it makes no sense, just to stay in practice. The United States, to my knowledge, does not have their chemical weapons positioned for use on the battlefield. They're in stockpiles in different places. I suppose they could be moved. The Russians, however, I would expect them to have chemical weapons at hand. Certainly, I would expect the North Koreans to have chemical weapons. And we know that the North Koreans have biological weapons. By the way, there's a news story out, I haven't been able to verify it, that North Korea is calling up 4 million men. Have you seen that today?
1 million men?
4 million men.
4 million.
That was a news story. I haven't verified it yet, but I heard this morning, and I want to see it from more than one source. But it could be that, there's some people that researchers that I compare notes with who think that the war is going to start in Korea next month. If it doesn't start next month, it won't be until next year. But of course, this is kind of frightening because, but anyway, we know the North Koreans have biological weapons, and one of the most powerful biological weapons, because North Korean soldiers defecting to the South, when they test their blood, yeah, there you go. Yeah, nearly 5 million want to join the army. So
Yeah,
see, this is
that's a Washington Post. North Korea claims almost 5 million have signed up
signed
to
up to
join.
join. Yeah, so they're bringing up. I mean, you really think 5 million people volunteered, in that country?
Oh my.
So what this means, what this story means, it's hard to say. But if they're actually calling them up, which is one version of the story I've heard, if this story means they're calling up, and what I heard was 4 million. Now this story says 5 million. If they're really calling up that many, that they wouldn't do that unless the war was imminent. And of course, there was testimony before Congress by a military expert saying that the North Koreans have not mobilized yet. This was this week. But
so when they will mobilize, that will be 10 million people.
Well, they have one of the largest conventional armies in the world. I mean, Korea is nothing but a giant barrack state. It's an armed society. It's a completely armed society where, most of the men in the country can be called up for military service. So that they can put together forces in great disproportion to the size of the country, which is quite extraordinary. North Korea is a kind of a weapon that the Chinese and the Russians have fashioned out of the Korean nation. But we know that they have biological weapons because when we test their defecting soldiers, we find antibodies for smallpox in their blood. Smallpox is a disease which has been eradicated for I think about a half a century. It's been eradicated. There's not been anybody who's had the disease for 50 years. And for people to have antibodies in it means that they have been inoculated against the weaponized form of smallpox. Now, weaponized smallpox was developed by the Soviet Union, and it is a particularly lethal kind of smallpox. People that are my age who got a smallpox vaccine when I was a baby.
I got it.
Because
what's that? I got it.
You got it when you were a child? Yeah. That vaccine will not protect you against weaponized smallpox because weaponized smallpox is so virulent. The Soviets created a version of smallpox that blisters the insides of the intestines, which of course causes people to bleed out and die from the inside out rather quickly.
Yeah. Jeff, this is so scary because look at this situation. They have destroyed us culturally. I mean, pedophilia right now, it's being promoted in Brazil and nobody saying anything against it. I mean, the population, of course, are complaining a lot, making protests front of the museum. I don't know if you have seen that, but in New York, they have been supporting I don't know how to say that in English. Sorry, but when you show, I mean, a show. Let's say a show. They are supporting a show. It's not a show. That's
a performance.
A performance. Performance. Yeah. Thank you. They in New York, a USA. I mean, an American museum on New York is supporting a performance in the south of Brazil, which has held zoophilia, pedophilia, crazy things involving Our Lady, Jesus Christ, and so forth. And when that was not enough, and we really put our social media against them, when we thought that was enough, so yesterday, not yesterday, I mean a day before yesterday, they put a naked man lying down on the floor and a child with a 5 years old. They call that performance. This 4 year old child touching this guy. So it's not enough to destroy our culture. It's not enough to destroy our religion because they infiltrated within the Catholic and Protestant, all Christians. They destroyed us philosophically, intellectually, because people are dumb. They are studying with these techniques. The communists love it, that destroy the reality and make you control your own. All these things are not enough. And now we have these weapons that can destroy our health, that can destroy, I mean, as the politicians say, a population on the order of tens of millions. They can destroy, I mean, the whole country just with these biological weapons.
In fact, Soviet military experts, I have a quote in the book, by the way, of an expert who says that it is the combination of biological with nuclear weapons that is the real killer. Because nuclear weapons, exposure to radiation lowers the immune system, lowers the immune reaction. So at the same time people get exposure to radiation, then they get exposed to a biological agent and they'll have no resistance to it. This is think about how diabolical these Russian strategists were back in the 60s, writing these things. And the idea that they're not the same today as they were then. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Russians' military thinking, all their generals were trained on these books that I'm quoting. They were trained on Soviet military strategy and Sidorenko's The Offensive, which talks about how to use nuclear weapons in the modern battlefield. This is the way they think. We cannot imagine this murderousness, but what you mentioned before about our culture, attacking our culture and our religion and our institutions and our children and the family, attacking the family. Look, there is no doubt that all of these are also weapons. B.H. Little Hart, the British strategist, wrote about grand strategy in his book, The Strategy of the Indirect Approach. And what Hart said in there is that there was the possibility of new grand strategic weapons that were intellectual weapons, weapons that could destroy people in their minds and their culture, flanking the country's military by attacking directly the family and reproduction and the raising of children. So, and this is what we've seen. And of course, if you trace the homosexual movement, if you trace the radical feminist movement, if you trace all these things, you will find that there are communists, whether it's Betty Friedan or whoever, at the beginnings of these movements, there were communists. Communists created these intellectual viruses that have hurt our society. And of course, it's ironic, but there was a military strategic reason for these ideologies. They created in the 50s and 60s ideologies that would directly impact on our war-making capacity. First, by making us defenseless against their ideology, and second, making it so that our children would be weak, too weak to be willing to fight, too weak. I mean, look at the decline in the birth rate in the West. The number of children who are fit enough to fight in a war. I mean, we've got this tremendous plague in the United States of obesity, to where the number of young men fit enough to fight has declined to shocking levels. How much do you want to bet that the Russians didn't infiltrate our food industry with the idea of making our food toxic? I mean, I don't have any specific knowledge. I know a Colombian friend who is constantly emailing me. He believes this absolutely, that our food and our health and our medicine has been
injected in the food, or just
infiltrated. Yeah. For example, this thing that heart disease is caused by animal fat, right?
Yeah.
And what my friend, my Colombian friend points out is that he said, look, what did they do in a concentration camp or a labor camp in the Soviet Union? They deprive, when they are on a starvation diet, when it's a labor death camp, they deprive the prisoners of any fat. They remove all fat from their diet and they die, because fat is sustaining. And by scaring people that fat causes heart disease, they've made the American diet to be satisfying. People have turned to sugar. Well, it turns out that now they're acknowledging, now there's new research coming out and saying, wait a minute, it's sugar that causes heart disease and diabetes and these other diseases and cancer. Because the sugar is a oh, I forget the word for it. It's a it creates an acidic environment. Yeah, it creates an acidic environment in the body, and it causes inflammation of the blood vessels for heart disease. It causes inflammation. Sugar causes inflammation in the body. Here we have denied ourselves the nutrition of good, healthy meats, and we have gone over to sugar, to this massive sugar-filled, high-calorie, sugary diet, and it's destroyed us health-wise. I mean, look at the cost to our medical establishment. Look at the cost to individuals. Look at the cost to health. And I was asking my friend Trevor Loudon about this. And you know what, Trevor shocked me. I wish I didn't expect to talk about this, but he said the doctor that came up with the idea that fat causes heart disease was a Communist Party USA member.
Oh my.
And Trevor named him. So, you know, the idea that there's sabotage in every field. Look, communism is an ideology that attacks its enemy on every possible conceivable dimension. In the dimension of education, in the dimension of health, in the dimension of the intellect, in the dimension of the family, in the dimension of religion. You see, every single sphere of human life, and human life is complex with many spheres, is open to attack by this kind of grand strategy. Because all of these things indirectly impact on a country's economy and in its war-making potential. And if the children of a country are given bad nutrition, when they could have the best nutrition in the world, it affects their intelligence. It affects the development of their intellect from their nutrition, from a nutritional standpoint. Yeah. So when you talk about chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare, they're already waging it on us through the kind of infiltration and propaganda that goes on every day. There is a war waged against the non-communist countries by the communist bloc, which in one of the aspects of this war is the communist bloc told us in 1991 that they had dissolved, that there was no communist bloc. But if you look at North Korea, you look at Russia and China with their joint military exercises they just concluded in the Sea of Japan, you look at South Africa, you look at what's happening in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Colombia, and in Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, you look all over the map. The communists are taking over everywhere, or trying to take over, and they are having enormous success, and country after country is still falling to communism. And we have not had proper lustration in the former Warsaw Pact countries. I mean, have they? Where was the lustration in Hungary? Where was the lustration in Romania, in Bulgaria? You know, Poland's a country that's struggling with it, that's really trying to do it. But the other Warsaw Pact countries, no. You know, Romania is having a terrible time. Yeah. You can't trust the military of these now NATO countries, and they're in NATO now. So, you know, this is a very serious thing that we have misunderstood our position strategically. And so now, of course, you have Putin there browbeating the United States that it hasn't destroyed its obsolete chemical weapons, which are probably unusable anyway, bragging that he's destroyed his. Well, that is totally incredible. Really, it's incredible.
Jeff, that's really, how can we see the future with that? Because if we have a few people that really want to fight back against this complex action from the communists, because as you said, they are not just attacking us politically. I mean, not just getting the president or the governor or so forth. They are attacking us. They have been attacking us for decades, almost 100. In Brazil since 1920. So they are attacking us through the movies. They are attacking us through health. I mean, this healthcare's idea, these conclusions that, I mean, from nothing, that sugar is bad. Something that, I mean, fat is bad, and another thing is bad. That, I mean, the human beings have been living with that nicely, I mean, without any problem, and they are changing everything culturally, and now they are threatening us with biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. North Korea is ready for a war. This war can be stopped if God wants, but doesn't seem so. That really seems to me, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, that really seems to me that North Korea is going to do something to provoke more and more the United States. And unfortunately, I think Trump will fight back. And if that happens, we'll have Russia and China saying, this is the narrative I see in on the media in the future. We gave up of our weapons. United States use it against North Korea. And now USA is the bad guy on the world. Is the only one country that want to control all the countries. So USA are saying they want to stop dictators, but they are the real dictator of the world. And now we have the solution for you guys. We, Russia and China.
Yes, that's exactly what we're seeing. That's what I see too. It seems rather obvious. When you understand the game that's being played on all levels in society, look, everybody knows that half a century ago, you know, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, even more recently, that there was this tremendous conflict called the Cold War, in which you had this large block of socialist countries armed to the teeth with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, facing the United States armed with chemical and nuclear weapons. They were facing off, and they were fighting wars in Africa and Asia and in Latin America, like in Nicaragua, for control of the future. And this Cold War, all of a sudden, everybody said it went away. But you see, something so serious as this massive standoff between this new religion of socialism, secular socialism, scientific socialism, Marxism, Leninism, this huge war just disappears. And what? All of those people that made up this huge empire of socialism, they all just went away. They all just disappeared overnight. I mean, this is really incredible, because never before has an empire just disappeared overnight like this and just said, oh no, we're different. Take down one flag, put up another flag. This is, when you look at the details of this, which I have done, you will find that defectors, major defectors to the West, warned that this was a strategy that was going to be used in advance. Major Anatoly Golitsyn of the KGB, Jan Sena, one of the highest level communist officials of communist Czechoslovakia, warned about it in his book, which was called We Will Bury You, written in 1982. Golitsyn's book predicted the fall of the Soviet Union as a strategy to entrap the West. He wrote that in 1984 in his book New Lies for Old. Even before Gorbachev became head of the Soviet Union, he predicted that the next Soviet leader would be a liberal, right, who would be like a Soviet Dubček. Dubček was a liberalizer in Czechoslovakia in '68. So you see, we have this testimony, and then when you go and you look at like Robert Buchar's documentary about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, that the revolution was ordered from Moscow, that the events did not take place as advertised, that the communists kept control of the country, that Václav Havel or Václav Klaus were agents of the Soviet Union. A guy, Václav Klaus, who sounds like a Czech Ronald Reagan, is actually an agent of the KGB. You have the notions, you know, solidarity in Poland. I've had, I don't know how many Polish activists and journalists have told me that Lech Walesa in Poland was an agent of the secret police. And so these changes, look at, and if you read Andrei Codrescu's book about the Romanian Revolution, The Hole in the Flag, Codrescu is one of the most famous Romanian Americans. He defected from communist Romania I think in the 60s or 70s, he went back into Romania when Ceausescu was overthrown, and he made this discovery that Ceausescu was overthrown by Russian agents, Moscow's agents inside the Romanian military. Okay? So in revolution after revolution, it's controlled by Moscow. It's a process that Moscow is advancing. And you see, look, Alan, think about this. Let's say you have a mass murder, because that's what the Soviet Empire was, a mass murdering empire. Let's say you have a mass murder like we have the famous murderer Charlie Manson here in prison here in California. Let's say you release Charlie Manson and you say, oh, he's not Charlie Manson anymore. He's Charlie Brown, right? He's not the Soviet Union. He's the Russian Federation. He's now a good guy. Wait a minute. The same people, the same guy with a different name. It changes his nature to change his name? To call the thing the Russian Federation now changes its nature? Just look at Vladimir Putin. He's a murderer. We know he's a murderer. The Russian government murders journalists. They killed Anna Politkovskaya, bullet to the head in the lift outside her apartment. They murdered Mr. Alexander Litvinenko in London with a radioactive weapon.
Plutonium?
No, not plutonium. Polonium.
Polonium.
Polonium, radioactive polonium. They give it to him, and then he died this horrible slow death on in 2006. These are horrible murders. I mean, they traced the radioactivity on the aircraft that the Russian assassins traveled from Moscow to London in. I mean, it left like a radioactive trail going back to the Kremlin. I mean, there's no doubt. Scotland Yard says it's a done deal. The Russians assassinated this guy with a radio. Why? Because he disagreed with Putin. Imagine who is a head of state who murders people who disagree with him, right? That's a murderer. That's a Hitler. That's a Stalin. That's a Mao. Vladimir Putin is a murderer. All right. When are we going to get this through our heads? He's not a Christian. He's not a conservative. And by the way, last year, he said on Russian TV, he said that he never destroyed his Communist Party card and that he was a communist because he likes communist ideas, quote unquote. So this is the man who's supposedly running the Russian Federation. But, we don't know who's really in charge. As a former president of Ukraine said on a Ukrainian television program a few years back, he said that Putin and Medvedev aren't the real rulers of Russia. The real rulers of Russia are a secretive group of, communists, behind the scenes, the Politburo, the Central Committee of the, and I've heard, Ukrainians who really are well informed about political things say, we are not fighting the KGB or Russia in Ukraine. We are fighting the Communist Party Soviet Union underground, which still controls in the former Soviet territory, still dominates, still kills people, still controls the media, the big companies, and the political system, even when it's pretending to be democratic.
In Ukraine, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
And Ukrainian people are day after day talking about this mass of destruction weapons in Russia, because they are closer than anyone in the world. I mean, they are really, they have border with Russia,
and they're fighting them. They're fighting the Russians now. Yes, there's a war going on in eastern Ukraine right now. Yeah. See, because the idea of freedom took hold in the Ukrainian people. And the Russians didn't know what to do. They wanted to be able to take over Ukraine, but they just took over parts of Ukraine. And they're trying to fight for the whole, but they have infiltrated the Ukrainian government's totally infiltrated by Russian agents. You can't trust the president or the prime minister of Ukraine. You can't trust the parliament. You can't trust the generals. But see, they're also afraid of the people of Ukraine, because the people of Ukraine have courage. The people of Ukraine found this tremendous courage and this belief in freedom, which has made Ukraine very difficult for Russia. And the Russians are scared to death that the Russian leaders, I should say, are scared to death that the idea of freedom carried in the Russian language is going to cross that border into Russia and is going to cause them to be overthrown. That is our #1 chance to avoid World War III, It's for freedom to take hold in Russia itself, the idea of freedom, which has been the basis of America and the English-speaking world since the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution in 1689, the American Revolution of 1776. And of course, you've had liberal revolutions in many European countries since. So, and of course, America and Brazil have similar histories, being the countries of colonies of European powers that got their freedom. And this makes us part of this common heritage of freedom. Russia's never had that. China has never had that. They've always had despotism. They've always had this sort of ugly imperialistic kind of regime. And communism is just a justification of a kind of imperialist regime. They can turn it into National Socialism. I mean, that's the form that Marxism-Leninism seems to have turned to in recent years. The Chinese seem to be National Socialists now, with a little wink at Mao Zedong, and the Russians too, National Socialists. I mean, if you look at their propaganda, because they're looking for the most workable, practicable form of socialism, and yet they work with the Marxists all over the world to establish Marxist regimes all over, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Nicaragua. Well, Daniel Ortega is a socialist dictator now. You know, there's been no real change in Cuba. And look at Venezuela. It's turning to a totalitarian hellhole in Venezuela. So, and God help Colombia if they let the guerrillas enter into normal politics, because when the communists are most effective when people think, oh, they're not communists anymore, they're just Democrats running for office, or they're running your local library, or they're in your corporations and they're in your health industry. No, it's always poison. They're always spreading some kind of poison. And people have to study this. They have to understand the methods that communism uses to take over society and form a dictatorship and to suppress the people, because that's what it does. It's a instrument of tyranny.
Jeff, we have a question here from our audience. Rodrigo Camargo, he's asking, what do you think about Tesla weapons? I mean, HARP and other kinds of directed energy. What do you think about it?
Well, I had a chance to talk with one of the Soviet former Soviet scientists, who was one of the top scientists in the Soviet Star Wars, Soviet directed energy program of the late 70s and 80s. And you know, he told me about their development of these weapons. They had many setbacks in Russia developing their weapons. Of course, particle physics, particle beams, lasers. This is a vast subject. The United States also has been working on these things. We've got laser type weapons on some of our ships for anti-ballistic missile weapons, because its primary use so far has been to shoot down missiles. That's how it's conceived. And I don't know really, because it's classified, how effective or what state the American and the Russian programs are in. I do know that by 1991, the Russian program had not, although it had the most promise, and that they had, there's evidence that in the 70s they actually shot down test missiles with particle beam weapons, that they never were able to make an effective counter weapon. By 1991, of course, that was, my goodness, more than 25 years ago. So what they have now, there's no telling how advanced the weapons are. Now you talk about Tesla weapons. There has been scientific speculation, because the Russians got hold of Tesla's papers after his death, a portion of his papers. I don't know the details of what were in the papers. That the Russians were developing Tesla weapons in the early 80s. Have you ever heard of what did they call it? Back in the early 80s, in the 1980s, there were these huge sonic booms up and down the US West and East Coast.
No, I never heard about that.
Yeah, and there was, people didn't know what they were, mystery explosions high in the atmosphere. And nobody really knew what they were. But there were some scientists who had some guesses. that they were part of a Soviet Tesla project, that the Soviets had developed a weapon, and there was an article in a book. Now I'm not remembering the book, but I read the book in the 80s, and it was put together by some experts in this area. And what they claimed is that the Russians had built these chambers, these underground chambers, for exploding nuclear weapons underground and harnessing the energy from the nuclear detonations. And then the claim was that these booms off the east and west coast, where they were calibrating the weapon. That is, they would do a nuclear explosion underground, and then they could transfer the energy to the other side of the planet and cause the actual effects of the nuclear explosion to manifest off the US east or west coast. So they could create an explosion. Now, there was an unexplained explosion in the Sea of Okhotsk, I'm not sure I'm saying it right, the Sea of Okhotsk, which is off of Siberia, on the Pacific side of Siberia. And I guess the Americans had got some kind of an aircraft into the cloud of the explosion. It was a nuclear size explosion, like a mushroom cloud type explosion. And we flew an aircraft, my understanding is, through the cloud to test it, and it had no radioactivity. Okay. No radioactivity at all. Now, this was what the people arguing that the Russians were developing a Tesla weapon, was that the nuclear explosion happened in an underground facility in Russia that harvested the energy and then sent the energy to the ocean off of Siberia, and then that's where the energy went. The explosion was transferred from this underground location, and so but the radiation stayed underground. So there was no radiation, there was just an explosion. And there was a claim, there were some people that claimed this was the Russian Tesla weapon. I don't know if that's true. You know, I'm just reporting what was said by some people at the time back, and this is 30 years ago. This is a long time ago. I don't know that we ever figured it out. I don't know what we knew about those things, what they were, you know, because I don't have access to classified information. I only know what there was speculation in publications at the time.
Sure.
And I don't know how credible that speculation was. I just don't know. I hope that answered the question about Tesla weapons.
Yeah, sure. We have another two questions here. The first one is Franklin Pinheiro. He's asking, Jeff, what is the intention of these nuclear tests in the very, very high? Why they are testing things that can use for, as they say here, 30 kilometers in high?
Well, I'm not sure what he's at. He's asking about testing nuclear weapons up in the atmosphere.
I think so.
Well, you know, we accidentally discovered, and the Russians also discovered, something called EMP, electromagnetic pulse effect. That nuclear weapons detonated in the Van Allen belt at an altitude of, I think it's like 130 kilometers. I don't know, however many miles, 100 miles up. That weapons detonated at these certain altitudes, nuclear weapons, they sort of have an amplifying effect from the Van Allen belt, from the radiation belt around the Earth, that then produces this pulse, this electromagnetic pulse, which is a electromagnetic wave that passes through its direct line of sight. And any antenna or electronic equipment in the path of this wave picks up this supercharge, which effectively is so strong that it fries the electronic components. For example, they had we did a nuclear test in the Pacific. I forget how many hundreds of miles from Hawaii it was, and it was a high altitude hydrogen bomb test, and it knocked the power out in Honolulu. Okay, so that's how we kind of discovered it. The Russians also had their giant bomb test, the super bomb test. It's the biggest hydrogen bomb ever exploded. I think it was in 1961 or 62. And that test caused electromagnetic pulse effect in the Soviet Union. And of course, from then, the study of these effects were very important, because these effects war-winning potential, because you could use an intentional EMP explosion to knock out enemy electronic defenses in advance of a nuclear attack. Does that make sense?
Yes, I just put some image here to people understand a little bit the amplitude and how that can reach. And here we have an article in WMD and about the EMP. Who want to see more information about?
Well, there's my friend Peter Pry, the expert on EMP. We've had him on the show a couple times. Yeah.
So who wants to see more about EMP? See the interview Peter Pry gave to Jeffrey Nikes and I here on Update Brazil. The last question, because our time is gone, unfortunately, is from Ronald M. Souza. He's asking, among this crazy situation, what is the rule of the Islamic terrorist?
The role of Islamic terrorism.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I need to explain something. This is, of course, Islam is a problem on its own, but in the late 1950s, when the hydrogen bomb was being perfected, because the first hydrogen bombs were tested in the 1950s, and when Sputnik went up, which was the first ICBM, really. Sputnik was an ICBM, because an ICBM is a rocket that can travel all the way around the Earth. They could leave the Earth's atmosphere. And so they had something then, the nuclear rocket weapon, a rocket that could go anywhere on the Earth that could have a nuclear warhead. And this changed the whole idea of what war was going to be, as you read from the quote of the Soviet strategist in my book. And the thing that happened is that Khrushchev was a leader of the Soviet Union at the time. He ordered a committee to be formed under Leonid Brezhnev, who became the successor of Khrushchev. This committee was to devise a new strategy for the nuclear rocket era. And in that strategy, it was a very complicated long-range strategy that they developed. But part of that strategy was to develop international organized crime and terrorism. And that terrorism was going to be one of the tools that the Russians would use. They would recruit and ally themselves and supply terrorists to attack the West. And as we know from Viktor Suvorov's book, Spetsnaz, Suvorov claims that there's a period just before World War II before World War III, a period before before a nuclear world war, in which terrorists would attack the West. And these terrorists would appear to have no connection with Russia. They would seem to be their own terrorist movement. And that this was a massive diversionary operation that would divert the security and military resources of the West to this enemy, this Islamic or whatever enemy. So that we would be then for years fighting this diversionary enemy and not preparing for the war coming with Russia and China and so on. And this seems to be what has happened. 9/11, by the way, I would point out that Muhammad Atta, I have sources in Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, that said that Muhammad Atta, the lead Islamic terrorist of 9/11, was trained at a communist terrorist training camp in communist Czechoslovakia in 1987, when he was a student in Hamburg, when he was I think he was an engineering student in Hamburg, if I remember correct, that he would travel to, and notice, before the attack on 9/11, he made multiple trips to Czechia, to Prague, that have never to this day been adequately explained. So this is one example. We know that Alexander Litvinenko, the man that he was a former KGB FSB officer who defected to Great Britain. He wrote and publicly said that Al-Qaeda was infiltrated by the KGB, and that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the current head of Al-Qaeda, was a long-time KGB agent. And that he knew this because he was responsible when Ayman al-Zawahiri went to train in Russia. Litvinenko was responsible for keeping his presence in Russia secret from the Russian interior ministry. So, because the KGB wanted it secret from, even kept secret from other Russian agencies.
And they got it.
Yeah. So I mean, this gives you, and of course the ease with which the communists could infiltrate Islam is shown in the Afghan War, where the Russians were in Afghanistan fighting the Muslims supposedly in their holy war against the Soviet Union. But when that war ended, the Muslim generals who got control of Kabul, since then we all know they were under Russian control.
Yeah. And
Hekmatar and Ahmad Shah Massoud with his lieutenant Mohammed Fahim, and also General Dostum, General Dostum, Rashid Dostum. They're all Soviet-controlled agents or Soviet generals trained. Some of them even trained in Soviet Central Asia. So the idea that the Mujahideen, you had this war supposedly between Islam, where we were supporting Islam, and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 80s, and it turned out that the victorious Muslim generals were all Russian agents or under Russian control in various ways. That's incredible. That is an incredible. And now the Taliban, we're seeing news stories that the Taliban has now come under Russian control. The Russians are good at infiltrating and taking control of other groups. You know, they call it controlled opposition.
And here the communists. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, and here the communists support them. I mean, publicly. I mean, openly. Hezbollah, Palestinian. I mean, the Workers' Party defend them.
Yeah, well, and you're talking about the Iranian terrorist groups. You know, Hezbollah is the Iranian terrorist group. You know that I had the chance to meet Claire Lopez at the event in Milwaukee I spoke at in May, and Claire is an expert on Iran, and Claire shocked me because she said that most of the Iranian leaders were trained in the Soviet Union. I mean, the Ayatollah Khamenei and all of these other Ayatollahs, they were all trained in Russia. So wait a minute, you mean they're Russian agents? Okay, how can they be trained in the communist Soviet Union and be true Muslims? You know, what is that? You know, I mean, I just marvel at this whole thing. This is so that Islam is hijacked and used by the communists. And that's what we see when you have these reports from Washington that the Russians aren't really attacking ISIS. Well, you've got these ISIS generals who are Russian-speaking, Soviet-born, Russian-trained people running ISIS, and former Saddam Hussein, Russian-trained Saddam Hussein Republican Guards guys in ISIS. I mean, what is this? These guys are secular. They're socialists. You know, they're socialists trained by the KGB and the GRU, and there they are in ISIS. It's very interesting. I mean, I don't believe that our intelligence agencies have really parsed this together correctly. There's a brilliant Lithuanian researcher who's written extensively about ISIS being full of Russian agents, and I can tell you that I have multiple Russian sources who've told me that the FSB in Russia is recruiting for ISIS right now. The Russian secret police are recruiting for ISIS now. I've got sources in Russia saying this, that this is known. So until we can get people to talk honestly about the subject, we have not had the proper discussion. We haven't had the proper analysis of the evidence. We've only had a skewed view of these things. And people, whatever the truth is in these various venues, I mean, I've been broadly researching this for 30 years, and again, it's amazing what turns up. If you follow this trail, it's consistent throughout. You find it again and again. I wish I could find evidence saying otherwise.
The only one
But
thing that's, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that was it.
The only one thing that's really froze me for a long time, it's the when you go that on this subject, the complexity of this subject, when you go deeper and deeper, you will get the conclusion, what can we do against it? I mean, just God can do something. I mean, we can work, we can try to mask them, we can try to convince people, but the real solution, we cannot give the solution to people, right?
Well, no, we can. I mean, look, I noticed a lot of these things in 1987. That's when I first started to wake up to how the game was played. I didn't know all the things that happened after 87, but I did know the Soviet Union was going to fake its collapse. I mean, I knew that because I read the defector literature and I said, oh, wait a minute, I get this game. I know how they're going to play it. And that's why I wrote that book that you have there on your desk, Origins of the Fourth World War. I wrote that in the 80s, basically. I mean, I finished writing it in the early 90s. That book was written, I started writing that book in 1987 because I realized nobody had really read the defector literature properly. Nobody had really listened to what these guys were saying, the warnings that they were giving us. And the reaction was, I mean, when I tried to talk to people about my book in the late 80s, in the early 90s, everybody thought I was crazy. So I said, all right, I'm just going to wait. And then by 1999, I got a call out of the blue from Art Bell, the radio guy. He was a #2 talk radio host at the time in America. He talked to me. He'd just gotten back from a trip from Russia. And he had had an exchange with a guy who'd read the manuscript of that book, Origins of the Fourth World War, before it was published. And he told Art Bell about the book. And Art Bell had had this experience in Russia where he experienced there's something fake about the changes in Russia. And Bell called me and told me this. He said, there's this changes in the Soviet Union. This is not right. I mean, and he described, he never talked about it on the air, but he told me. And that's why he invited me on his show. So see, what happens is that the truth, see, if you have the truth versus the lies, the truth eventually becomes, and that's how my book got published, because Art Bell had that experience and he brought me on his show. That's how I got to write all the columns I got. That's how I got to write other books. But you see, and I've noticed this, from in 1987, you couldn't talk to anybody. In 1999, I could talk about it on the radio, even though most people wouldn't listen. Now, today, more and more people are listening. More and more people are starting to, a light is going on, you see, because as we're getting closer to what the enemy is doing, it becomes more obvious. What they're doing in your country, in Brazil, has become so obvious. There's a kind of awakening in Brazil, right?
Yes.
There's a kind of awareness. This protest against Dilma Rousseff is a very telling thing. And here in the United States, the Tea Party movement, which was aware there was something wrong with Obama's socialism, and they were scared of Obama's socialism, so that they were aware that, you know, and then you have people emerging like Trevor Loudon and Diana West, you know, and Cliff Kincaid, and Olavo. You know, you've got these great people who also see the truth. See, so I'm not alone. I'm not the only, I'm not some graduate student who actually did the reading, right? And actually said, oh, this is going to happen. I mean, this is what they're doing. Other people have gotten an understanding. And pretty soon, the whole planet's going to know. Everybody's going to know. And you see, the truth is powerful. And even though, you know, it's Napoleon, when he was on his way to exile, he said that the greatest person was Jesus Christ, because he did the greatest change of humanity, and he did it without war. And Napoleon said, you know, war is really a very negative thing. It's not really the true way to change people and to change the world. It's the truth that matters. So how far are they going to get? How many people more people are they going to kill? These wicked individuals that run the communist movement or run Russia or China, we don't know, but they're not going to win in the end, because the lies are always found out. People eventually wake up. So, you know, you got to have faith. You just got to have faith.
Sure. And people like you inspire us, really, because Terce Livre started in November 2014. and we see this awakening with our own eyes. I mean, we started with 3 people watching us. Now we are 140,000 people following us on YouTube. So, Jeff Nyquist, thank you very much again. Your words are more than enlightenment. It's inspiring. That's really helped us. Thank you a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, I see you next week on Update Brazil. As soon as we can, we are translating this video. Now I have a note for my Brazilian people that don't speak English. Se você conhece alguém que pode nos ajudar a colocar a legenda aqui embaixo no vídeo, existe um link que eu disponibilizo abaixo do Update Brazil. Você pode clicar nesse link e pedir para as pessoas ajudarem a traduzir. So you can help translating these videos, Update Brazil videos. Just click on the link and I will put on a comment and in our description. So thank you very much and God bless you. Bye-bye.